Harry has outlined becoming increasingly kind of significant in terms of a sort of alternative politics around ecology, environmental issues, and so on. So, funnily enough, I thought I was kind of preparing for this, and I thought, let me just look up countryside and see if there's a sort of interesting definition of that word, which has always slightly sort of troubled me. And I found the top one that came up wasn't Google, it was some other server. It was a Cambridge dictionary, and it said land not in towns, cities, or industrial areas that's either used for farming or left in its natural condition. Okay. And then the examples were, the countryside around here is beautiful. The next one is, the mansion is set in 90 acres of beautiful, unspoiled countryside. So I think, well, there obviously is the problem and how we use that term and what we actually mean by it. So what I thought I'd do tonight is really describe the book that I've written that Harry kindly waived, and why I wrote it the way I did, and give a couple of examples of how I've tried to thread together some of the different themes, and then we can have a discussion and see what you all have to say as well. So in terms of my background, for many years I've been writing about racism in this country, about national identity, the way that racism has degraded our politics, particularly feminist politics, the importance of acknowledging the past, whether it's plantation slavery, empire, colonial society, and so on, but how we might also imagine a different relationship between this country and the rest of the world. And about 20 years ago, slightly more than that, I decided that I would write about the place where I grew up, which is a village in northwest Hampshire. And so I wrote a version of what I thought was interesting, but it got completely hijacked by A, going to live in the States, B, not really enjoying the process very much, writing about the village where you grew up and you don't really live there anymore, it's kind of problematic, and C, the Iraq War. So the book was a bit of a hodgepodge, and surprisingly, nobody was at that time was that interested in publishing it. It was before the era of nature writing and place writing that now, we're sort of currently enjoying. So the years went by and I wrote about other things. I wrote a book about the army and wrote a book about national identity. And then I came back to this, and then the book came out in February this year. And it's quite a different book. But the important thing is why I mention it is it draws on some of that oral history that I did at the time. And also it represents a way of thinking about these issues for over a very long time. And I think that matters because, I will explain. So, well, for one thing, knowing a place well over a long period, more than 60, 65 years, actually, I decided gives you an opportunity to see how change happens over a period of time. So I decided to use this history, not in terms of telling a story about myself or about my family, but to use that sense of connection to a place from which I actually was quite alienated, coming and going over many years, over many decades, but having that sort of deep connection, decided to use that as an opportunity to examine actually what this question of rural is. What do we mean by rural? But not just that, it's an opportunity to trace the workings of agrarian capitalism, for example, changes in farming, the impact of colonial history, colonialism, and the slave trade too, industrialization, financialization, privatization, war and militarization, all those fundamental processes that have shaped the world that we live in today. So I wanted to investigate these issues, these phenomena within a framework of global history as well. And I knew that the clues were there because I knew I had grown up in that milieu. And I also wanted to respond to the overlapping crises that are taking place today in different scales. including but not confined to the environmental, the social, political, cultural. And as I said, I also wanted to contest this idea of the countryside as being, or the rural as being somehow outside politics. It's like rural England, for so many people on the left, is like this kind of sink. It's a sort of backward place that's pulling the country down. Most parts of rural England vote Tory, for example, or have a Tory representative. And I wanted to really challenge that and investigate it. At the same time, recognizing that, what a lot of people think of as the countryside actually represents a utopian space as well, a place where nothing much is happening and people can go and sort of remake themselves or find themselves, which is also a bit problematic. And you know how people use that word rural idyll all the time? They sort of drop it in. It's always in the headlines. It's always people mentioning it, whether it's to do with housing or whatever. People use it ironically, but every time you hear the word rural idyll or you find yourself using it, you have to check yourself, because actually all it does is it shows that you don't know anything about the complexity and diversity of rural life. And it's a sort of cliche. But honestly, once you become aware of it, you do hear it being used all the time, often, to do with a sort of critique of the rural, at the same time as recognizing there's something about it. So I really wanted to think about the impact of industrial capitalism as a story of urbanization, of sort of sucking people out of rural areas into the towns and cities, producing a growing rift between town and country, and producing this idea of what we now call the countryside, this sort of empty space. So that makes us think, well, do we actually need the terms urban and rural? What do they actually mean? Interestingly, when you look at the proportion of land that is classified as rural in different countries, Britain is not at all particularly kind of known for having a large amount of rural country, but it's very famous for its rural parts. And actually, in that sense, it's very different from other European countries like the Netherlands or Germany or France. These countries don't really sell themselves on the basis of this countryside and the kind of culture that surrounds that, to do with, romantic poetry, literature, films, and so on. So England particularly is quite specific like that. But then in his book about the toxic politics of English nationalism, New Model Ireland, I don't know if you know that book, Alex Niven wrote that the great divide in English life is between the cities and everywhere else. And that's partly an economic question. Obviously, there's a national crisis caused by the dearth of affordable housing everywhere, but the extent of rural poverty is seldom really reported or commented on. And I should say that, I am talking about England, I guess, in this discussion. There's a focus on England, but actually there is the England within a kind of global scale. Many aspects of the discussion, many aspects of the book itself are completely inextricable from global issues. So, as I said, the place that I decided to write about, or where I grew up, is in northwest Hampshire. It's on the borders of Berkshire and Wiltshire. So on one side, you've got Salisbury Plain. You can actually hear the sort of rumbling guns and the Chinook helicopters flying over. And on the other side, you've got like Downton Abbey, the Highclere Castle is about 10 miles away. And to the south, running past the south of Andover, is the A303, sometimes called the Highway to the Sun, which takes people from London to Cornwall and Devon. It's a sort of seaside road. Some of you may know that, those of you who know the south. But it's a place which is in the south, but it's not near the coast. It's not southwest enough to be southwest. It's not southeast really either. So it's in an area of outstanding natural beauty, just on the edge, on the North Wessex Downs. The first thing I wanted to say, the first book I wrote that I mentioned before was a book about the village where I grew up. I decided that was very problematic to write about a village. The idea of village is also a kind of very strong kind of cultural construct. I didn't really want to write about my village because I didn't really know anyone there anymore. My mother still lived there. She was in her 90s. And most of the people who'd moved in weren't there when I was growing up. So it was a kind of huge distraction, really, thinking about a village as a community. So I decided to stand outside on a crossroads, which was in the same parish, but it wasn't actually in any village. It was sort of in the middle of nowhere. There was a signpost there. The signpost pointed to 8 different places. Some were small villages, some were medium-sized villages, and then there was Newbury in one direction and the town of Andover in another direction. And all this provided a kind of geography within which to think about the formation of the rural, the small villages, the parish, the borough, the county, and how these different sort of administrative and policy-related constituencies shaped these places. So standing at the signpost, I decided to think about how I could see the world from there. So I wasn't distracted by knowing people and knowing, the village itself. I could literally start with the signpost and look down at my feet and think about the soil underfoot and what kind of life that soil was able to sustain. And what was the history of this particular land? Well, standing at a crossroads, obviously there were several fields at my disposal. And one of the reasons I chose that place is that it is known as a heathland, even though it looked like just regular fields. It was called a heath. So it entailed thinking about a particular kind of ecology. And then I knew someone who I'd interviewed 20 years earlier who told me that one of those fields was an area of common land that was ploughed up in the 40s in the war. And it was never given back to the villagers, even though it was promised to be given back because it was an area of downland. And so I was able to sort of explore that throughout the book to find out why it wasn't given back, what happened to it, and how it was farmed. So that was one story. And then I discovered that actually that piece of land, the downland, had actually been enclosed in 1818. And I looked to see who'd enclosed it, and it was a family, a Scottish name. I looked up the family on the UCL British legacies of slave ownership and found that the people who'd enclosed it had actually owned a sugar plantation in St. Kitts. And one of the reasons I didn't know who they were and didn't recognize their name is that actually they had lived in another parish. So then I explored the parish boundaries and the fact that the history of the parish. So there's actually very little written about the history of the parish. It's a very fascinating phenomenon. It's like the sort of basic unit of democracy in our country, one that was exported to the colonies as well. So that was another sort of vector. So there's a lot to say about how you research a place. And there's a lot of literature at the moment out about places, about particular kinds of ecologies, particular rivers and mountains and, particular forms of sort of natural environments. And this isn't in any way a local history. In fact, the people who live there have shown zero interest in the book. It's the question, what I wanted to do was to approach it through a sort of post-colonial framework as well, which is to sort of situate this place within a much wider history. And what I ended up realizing was that in order to write about a place, you have to actually talk about everything. You have to try and connect everything. And this is a form of ecological thinking that's inspired by, many other philosophers and thinkers, like Timothy Morton, for example, is one. Murray Bookchin was a great inspiration. And surprisingly, not surprisingly, it was a surprise when I found it, William Morris. actually wrote a fantastic essay called Under the Shade of an Elm Tree, where he basically lies on the ground and looks around him and finds the history of the world around him, which perhaps we can talk about later. So because the book connects sort of everything together and makes lots of, how can I say, it's quite a hard book to describe. And I want to give you an example of how I thread things together. There are 10 chapters, and there's a whole chapter on chicken farming, for example. There's a lot of stuff about farming. And I saw in the chat that already there's a great interest in that. This is the story of the agrarian revolution, followed by the revolution in industrialization, and right up to the present day. So there's a lot of ground to be covered. I thought I might really talk about fertilizer as one of the connecting threads. So fertilizer, about which I knew very little. So in the book, there's a guy who's my age, who's the sort of farmer who I kind of grew up alongside. He wasn't in my class at primary school, but I know his family, and he very kindly agreed to talk to me over a period of 20 years. And he's also a conservationist. He's sort of early person who got money to be a steward of the from Hampshire Council. He's creating environments for birds and so on. So he's a very interesting person to talk to over the years. But also I knew people. I had talked to people in the late 90s who could remember far back before the Second World War. People who'd been, whose grandfather had sort of set up the village school in 1910, people whose memories went back a long way. So I was able to draw on that. There's about 2 or 3 characters that I could draw on, and they actually had passed away by the time I wrote this version. But I had their testimonies that they'd left me, which was very useful. So I think that what I discovered, I think you could probably discover anywhere in this country, if you just stand and look and ask and be open to the kind of clues that are all around you, that are fairly easy to pick up. So, for example, thinking about fertilizer, obviously I had many discussions about what Johnny, this farmer, used now and why he used it, and how that had changed. However, one of the threads I started to pull at was that there was a scandal in the local workhouse in 1846. There was a scandal in the Andover workhouse. Just put it very briefly, I discovered through reading, actually it was a copy of Monthly Review, that the British, in their sort of zeal to increase their farming yields in the early part of the 19th century, used bone meal. And obviously bone meal is a finite amount of bone meal you can kind of harvest or get hold of for your farm. So it was sourced from battlefields in Europe. And Britain was the only country that did that. So it would actually import bones from, the Battle of Waterloo, for example. And there are sort of first eyewitness descriptions of this happening. And I was able to find evidence that it was happening. So that was the kind of shock that this was going on, that actually the bones of the men who'd gone off to fight in the Napoleonic Wars were coming back as bones to be ground up and used by landowners. Anyway, the Andover workhouse, there was a scandal because in the new Poor Law regime, which necessitated the building of these workhouses all over the country, the treatment of the people who were fortunate or unfortunate enough to be there was such that it was the subject of a national inquiry in 1846. So the men and boys who were in this workhouse in Andover, and the house is still there, it's in fancy flats now, but you can see it's got 1836 written over the front. They were bones were delivered from local butchers and things, and they had to grind them with kind of poles. And they were so hungry that they were gnawing these bones, even though they weren't fresh. And this came to the notice of journalists and then to Parliament, and there was a big investigation. what they were doing was that they were making fertilizer, which was then sold at a cut rate to the local landowners, many of whom were actually in charge of the workhouse. So this has been written up and I mean, we never taught it at school, but it put me on a road to thinking about fertilizer bones, the desperation for fertilizer, and just being sensitized to the importance of this and telling a particular story about rural poverty, the development of agrarian capitalism, its relationship to industrialization, urbanization, and so on. So that was one thing. Second thing was the swing riots, which was otherwise known as the last rural war that took place in 1831. So they were very militant around the Andover area. You may know they started in Kent, I think, and yes, it started just south of Canterbury and spread all around Sussex, up into Hampshire, around, and eventually up, I think, to Norfolk and Suffolk. And then they were kind of put down. The revolts were put down very brutally by the militia, and a number of people were transported, 19 were executed, and a huge number were imprisoned or otherwise punished. And Andover was a very militant centre, and that's another whole set of stories. So the connection between the swing riots being the last rural war, obviously it's very important in the history of industrial capitalism, because it's the sort of, the swing riots were really prompted by the beginning of the mechanization of farming. It was all about the threshing machine and the fact that the sort of piecework that people had relied on for their food for wages really from the parish for the last 3 months of the year suddenly vanished because the threshing machine did all the threshing and people's labor was not required. So it was really the beginnings of people being thrown off the land because there was no work for them. And then the kind of criminalization and, impoverishment of those who lived in rural areas. So again, that story is connected to the Andover workhouse, because not only has there been amazing research which shows you who was arrested for what in every part of the country, that has subsequently been done by historians, I could find that standing at my signpost, there were people within the villages around me who had been involved in these riots in 1831, and their relatives still lived in the same areas. So to go back to fertilizer, basically, it's hard to compress this, but I would say that there was a German scientist called Justus von Liebig, who was a kind of innovator, both as a researcher and a teacher, and an industrialist himself, and actually an entrepreneur. He's a very important figure. And he was very interested in British farming and the innovations that were being carried out at Rothamsted and early part of the 19th century. He also had a thing about fertilizer, and he had a factory that made artificial fertilizer, because people realize you can't just go on hammering the ground and growing more and more crops without putting stuff back in. Now, at a certain point, Liebig realized that you can't just keep putting in artificial chemicals. You can't do that the soil itself is being depleted. And in 1863, I think, he rewrote the introduction to one of his books on the subject, in which he denounced Britain for hanging like a vampire on the neck of the world in sort of, harvesting bones from battlefields. That's where the information comes from. And so he denounced the idea that you can keep, on the one hand, just using the soil over and over again to make more profit, and at the same time not using the kind of I suppose you could call it a natural process of human waste going back into the soil, that by separating out what happened to human waste and all the drains that had been built to channel all the sort of human excrement out into the sea, that actually that was the problem that was causing the system to be in danger of collapsing. So he wrote this diatribe against what Britain was doing, breaking what he called sometimes it's translated as a metabolic rift, but like this break between what is supposed to happen, that humans consume food, it passes through them, and that waste goes back into the soil, and that's all part of the process. That by breaking that, that was setting up, a huge problem for the future. Now, Marx was very taken by Liebig. He read his stuff. As I said, he was a very innovative scientist. And that's why in Capital, Marx wrote about capitalism not only robbing the worker, but robbing the soil. So he was very influenced by Liebig. Now, all these threads about fertilizer in the 19th century, they're all interconnected, and they all came about by standing in one place and thinking about farming, fertilizer, and local social history. And there are other aspects of that as well. So I've gone on a bit long, but I just wanted to explain how some of these threads work together. And it sounds like a sort of social history that's really, obsessed about the 19th century, but that's only a fragment of it. And of course, what happened next is an issue, and that's also part of the story. And the book is also looking forward to the future as well, as I said, in terms of a dialogue with the farmer about what's used these days, and what the sort of prohibitions are, and what the kind of likelihood is in future. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that made some kind of sense in terms of trying to weave some of these things together to tell a very, very different story about what we call the countryside.